So Alyssa, what's on your radar?
So a few months back, President Biden charged the intel community to investigate the origins of COVID-19 and present a report back to him within 90 days. Yesterday, the White House received the report, but early indications from leaked reports suggest that the report itself fails to find a definitive answer on the origins of COVID. So according to Reuters, the intel review could be released to the public within the next few days. However, according to 3 U.S. government officials with knowledge of the report, they do not expect the review to lead to firm conclusions on the origins of COVID. Now, this comes as no surprise nearly 2 years after the first cases of COVID-19 were popping up abroad in late 2019. It has been well documented that the Chinese government took extreme efforts to withhold information on cases, all while the virus was spreading beyond mainland China and into other parts of the globe. Way back in early January 2020, when known cases of COVID-19 were few and primarily restricted to Wuhan, the capital of the Hubei province was getting ready for the annual Two Sessions meeting, where local governments gather to discuss state affairs, and the meetings are heavily monitored by Beijing. It's an opportunity for local governments to show off how well they're doing, but also to avoid raising any negative news. In the initial days, it seems to have been the Wuhan local government that tried to hide what simply seemed like a bad outbreak of pneumonia from Beijing officials. But from there, as the outbreak spread, the Chinese government officials began cracking down on doctors and scientists who tried to raise flags about its transmissibility, origins, and spread, notably punishing and shaming doctors who spoke out. This was the toxic culture that existed throughout China in the critical early days of the virus as it spread rapidly. This was a key time to both learn about where it may have come from, but also to notify the world of its transmissibility. Now, for all intents and purposes, China did neither, allowing the virus to spread and its origins to remain obscured, even 2 years later. In July of this year, China rejected the World Health Organization's plan for the second phase of the study into the origins of COVID-19, which could have implicated China's lab. China's Vice Minister of Health said he was taken aback by the request and dismissed the efforts to research the lab leak theory as a rumor that runs counter to common sense, dismissing whistleblowers, doctors, and scientists who attempt to get to the bottom of the origins of COVID-19 has been a strategy throughout the virus. Dr. Alina Chan, a postdoctoral fellow at the Broad Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, raised flags early last year that COVID-19 seemed to be mutating, going against the common wisdom at the time. She also suggested that those findings went against the common wisdom that the virus naturally spilled over to humans from bats. Her hypothesis was ridiculed and disputed by others in the scientific community. She was mocked as a conspiracy theorist and dismissed as a junior scientist by those senior to her. The merits of her argument were dismissed outright rather than countered with proven science. And we all recall when Senator Tom Cotton was harangued by the mainstream media and called a conspiracy theorist for raising very valid questions about the origin of the virus. A February 2020 Washington Post article is aptly titled, "Tom Cotton Keeps Repeating a Coronavirus Fringe Theory That Scientists Have Disputed." Now, fast forward to July 2021, when we still seem to know so little about COVID. CNN ran this headline: "Senior Biden officials finding that COVID lab leak theory as credible as natural origins explanation. It would seem Tom Cotton wasn't so crazy after all." Now, in the coming days, the public should see the findings of the Biden administration's intelligence review into COVID's origins. I believe the early leaks from government officials that they were unable to draw a definitive conclusion about the origins of the virus. But that is simply because the Chinese government spent months covering it up during the critical early days of the virus. Think of how much more we could know today and how many potential lives could be saved if we knew where this thing came from. Now, I'm not holding my breath for China to suddenly do the right thing and cough up the intelligence they have, but I will pause and think twice next time someone is dismissed as a crazy conspiracy theorist. Kim, I want to go to you on this because I think you've had a really reasonable and measured approach to coronavirus throughout, someone who's a skeptic, but I also think tries to follow the science. What do you expect to see from this report, and will we ever get to the bottom of the origins of COVID-19?
I expect to see absolutely nothing from this report, and for a variety of reasons. I think that you're right. The Chinese definitely covered things up, but I also think that, the Wuhan lab was an international lab with a lot of international funding, some of that funding coming from U.S. tax dollars from the NIH. And so if the virus did come from there, and there's still even questions about that because we do have samples, tissue samples, blood samples, showing that people seem to have had contracted coronavirus, like in Italy. We've got samples from livers showing that maybe they had it in September of 2019. We have the same sort of thing from California, showing earlier in the fall or even earlier in the summer. So there's a lot of questions on when this virus was really circulating around. But certainly if, let's say it did come from Wuhan in China, then I would think that there's even an incentive to cover it up from the American side of things as well, because of Fauci, because of NIH. So I don't know, I just think if this did come from a lab and governments were involved in experimenting and research, then they're all going to collectively, I think, try to cover it up, and maybe even put pressure on China to do more to cover it up. I mean,
right. And I think the origins question is so important because we're still trying to learn about the virus. We're trying to figure out how transmissible is it? Can it mutate? How long is it going to be with us? And I think we could have so much more information about how to treat it and how to potentially inoculate if we had a sense of where it was coming from.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's also so hard, I think, for people to contemplate the idea that all of this was avoidable. Mm-hmm. If the pandemic originated from nature, it sucks, it's terrible, but it's part of living in the planet. We've had plagues for thousands of years. We understand what that is. Just the idea that we did this to ourselves is just, I think, too much for some people to just bear. Thinking about all of the death, all of the suffering, all of the lives upended. But examining the origins can at least raise the cost of doing this gain-of-function research. It raises the stakes, and so it then requires much more public input, or it ought to require much more public input to weigh in and be like, you know what, this isn't actually just a conversation that should be had among public health officials in the scientific community, because we're part of this world too, and you might have a cost-benefit analysis that you think is acceptable. Maybe we don't.
I just don't think we're ever going to find out where this thing came from. I mean, there's just too many. We don't even know if it came from nature. Maybe it came from a bat, or maybe the bat gave it to some other animal, and now we've got. So I mean, it's just, and then you of course have the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians saying, well, we think it came from the Americans. So it's like everybody's and I say this all the time, everybody's a suspect still, including the bat. We still got to find the bat, find the lab, find the origin, but I just don't think we ever are going to. But we should, if it did come from a lab, and this is gain of function research. Yeah, Ryan. I mean, you're right. We've got to put the hammer down on this. We cannot have this happen again to us. This has been terrible. And the next virus might be way worse if they're doing gain-of-function research on it. And we still don't even know what this virus is going to do.
Absolutely. And more rising after this.